Chapter 3 of Historical Materialism by Maurice Cornforth. The Role of Ideas in Social Life. Part 1. The material life of society determines its views and institutions. The second guiding principle of historical materialism is that the current views in society, together with the institutions of society, are always in the last analysis determined by the conditions of material life. In other words, the application of materialism to social questions leads to the conclusion that the material life of society determines its spiritual life. For materialism, matter or the material world is primary, while mind or thought is secondary and derivative. The existence of interrelationship of material things does not depend on our ideas of them, but on the contrary, our minds and the ideas in our minds depend on the prior existence and interrelation of material things. Applied to society, this means that the origin of all the views current in society lies in the conditions of material life of society and not the other way about. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, wrote Marx, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. Critique of Political Economy, Karl Marx. The material life of society is an objective reality existing independently of the will of men, while the spiritual life of society is a reflection of this objective reality, wrote Stalin, explaining Marx's standpoint. Hence, the source of formation of the spiritual life of society, the origin of social ideas, social theories, political views, and political institutions should not be sought in the ideas, theories, views, and political institutions themselves, but in the conditions of the material life of society, of which these ideas, theories, views, etc., are the reflection. Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Stalin. This is the very opposite of what is usually taught, and it implies in turn that the ultimate causes of historical events are not to be found in the changes in men's ideas, but in the changes in the conditions of material life. The whole previous view of history was based on the conception that the ultimate causes of all historical changes are to be looked for in the changing ideas of human beings, wrote Engels. But the question was not asked as to whence came the ideas come into men's minds. The ideas of each historical period are most simply to be explained from the economic conditions of life and from the material and political relations of the period, which are in turn determined by these economic conditions. Consequently, the ultimate causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insight into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. The growing perception that existing social institutions are unreasonable and unjust, that reason has become unreason and right wrong, is only proof that in the modes of production and exchange, changes have silently taken place, with which the social order, adapted to earlier economic conditions, is no longer in keeping. Engels, Socialism, Scientific and Utopian, Chapter 3. Let us take an example. It is often supposed that our forefathers overthrew the formal feudal relations of subordination because the idea was born in their minds that men were equal and should enjoy equality of rights. But why should this idea have suddenly become so influential? Why should the feudal relations of subordination, for which centuries had been held to be just and reasonable, suddenly began to appear unjust and unreasonable? Those questions lead us from the sphere of ideas to the sphere of the conditions of material life. It was because material, economic conditions were changing that people began to think in a new way. The existing feudal relations were no longer in keeping with developing economic conditions. It was the development of economic activity and economic relations which created the forces which overthrew feudalism and laid the foundations for capitalism. And so the rise and spread of the idea of equality of rights as opposed to feudal inequality followed upon and reflected the changes in material conditions of life. Again, why should the idea of socialism, the idea of social ownership of the means of production, have suddenly grown influential once capitalism was underway? For centuries, private property had been regarded as just and reasonable, and even as the necessary basis for civilized society. But now, on the contrary, it began to appear unjust, unreasonable, oppressive. Once more, this new way of thinking and the profound influence which socialist ideas began to exert arose from new economic conditions. Under capitalism, production was ceasing to be an individual matter and becoming a social matter, and private property and private appropriation based on private property were no longer in keeping with the new character of production. In general, the rise of new ideas can never be regarded as a sufficient explanation of social changes, since the origin of ideas and the source of their social influence must always itself be explained. And this explanation is, in the last analysis, to be sought in the conditions of material life of society. We shall find, accordingly, that corresponding to the different conditions of material life of society at different periods, quite different ideas are current, and that the differences in the views of different classes in different periods are always, in the last analysis, to be explained in terms of the differences in conditions of material life. Does it require deep intuition, asked Marx and Engels, to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? Manifesto of the Communist Party, Chapter 2. If at different times men were imbued with different ideas and desires, wrote Stalin, the reason for this is that at different times men fought nature in different ways to satisfy their needs, and, accordingly, their economic relations assumed different forms. There was a time when men fought nature collectively, on the basis of primitive communism. At that time their property was communist property, and, therefore, at that time they drew scarcely any distinction between mine and thine. Their consciousness was communistic. There came a time when the distinction between mine and thine penetrated the process of production. At that time property, too, assumed a private individualist character, and therefore the consciousness of men became imbued with the sense of private property. Then came a time, the present time, when production is again assuming a social character, and, consequently, property too will soon assume a social character. And this is precisely why the consciousness of men is gradually becoming imbued with socialism. First, the material conditions change, and then the ideas of men, their habits, customs, and their world outlook change accordingly. Anarchism or Socialism by Stalin, Chapter 2. The laws of social development, to the economic aspect of which we have already referred, have, therefore, this further aspect. They include the laws whereby, on the basis of the given material or economic conditions of society, there arises a whole superstructure of social views and corresponding institutions. The economic structure of society always constitutes the basis on which the views and institutions of societies arise and to which they correspond. The rise of new views and new institutions always reflects the fact that economic conditions are changing. Thus, in different periods of history of society, different social ideas, theories, views, and political institutions are to be observed. Under the slave system, we encountered certain social ideas, theories, views, and political institutions. Under feudalism, others. And under capitalism, others still. Whatever are the conditions of material life of society, such are the ideas, theories, political views, and political institutions of that society. Stalin, Dialectical and Historical Materialism.